and welcome to Book Breaks. We are so thrilled to have you today as we welcome our friend Peniel Joseph and his book Freedom Season: How 1963 Transformed America's Civil Rights Revolution. And I'm your host, Gina, and I'm joined by my friend Ryan, who's going to be taking your questions in the second half of the program. Hey, Ryan. And without further ado, we are so thrilled to have Dr. Peniel Joseph, who is a professor of public affairs, the Barbara Jordan Chair in Ethics and Political Values, and founding director of the Center for the Study of Race and Democracy at the University of Texas at Austin. He's also the author of The Sword and the Shield, The Revolutionary Lives of Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr., as well as other books. Welcome, Dr. Joseph. We're so thrilled to have you here today.
Oh, it's great being here, Gina. Thank you.
And just to start us off, can you give us an overview of this book?
Yeah, absolutely. So, Freedom Season is a narrative history of 1963, and it really tells this kaleidoscopic story of the way in which America, with civil rights as its center, unravels that year and comes back together and creates a new racial justice consensus that really, I argue, lasts for the next 50 years from 1963 to through 2013 and the Shelby Holder decision. And so along the way, you get to meet James Baldwin, who's one of the through lines, the Kennedy brothers, Malcolm X, Martin Luther King Jr., Gloria Richardson, the civil rights activist from Cambridge, Maryland, who's doing such militant protests and impresses people like Malcolm X, has clashes with Bobby Kennedy and others. Lorraine Hansberry, the brilliant playwright, who's close friends with James Baldwin and is one of the leading radical internationalist feminists of the period. Um, and also look at some of the conservative counter-revolutionaries with people like George Wallace and Strom Thurmond and Sheriff Jim Clark, some of the intellectuals of the era like William F. Buckley and National Review. So it's a panoramic view of 1963, and it was the first time I ever wrote a book about a single year, and that was very interesting and fun to do because it let me get deeper into the stories of that time from both the bottom up and the top down. So Kennedy administration is there. LBJ has a sort of a pivotal supporting role, but Bobby and Jack are really front and center. But you're able to see the way in which Malcolm X evolves that year. You're able to see the activism of Medgar Evers before his assassination. And you're able to see the way in which these ideas um, about dignity, citizenship, democracy, freedom are debated and contested throughout the year, really at the local, national, and global level.
Yeah, and what can the top two college speakers of that year tell us about sort of the political discourse of the time?
Oh, yeah, that's a great, when you think about the top two speakers, number one is Barry Goldwater, very, very conservative senator from Arizona, really the author of a kind of movement conservatism that is going to lead to not just Richard Nixon, but Ronald Reagan and other transformations along the right. And number two is Malcolm X, and Malcolm X is the Black America's prosecuting attorney during especially that year of 63, really prosecuting America for a series of crimes against Black humanity in a very, very eloquent way. But you also see his growth throughout the year. I mean, he starts the year leading protests against police brutality in Rochester, New York. And King starts the year at a religious conference in Chicago with Jewish and Christian and other leaders, and the Nation of Islam makes a cameo appearance there.
Yeah.
And James Baldwin starts the year in Mississippi with Medgar Evers and James Meredith. So I was really, and Lorraine Hansberry starts the year protesting against the prosecution of William Worthy, the most famous Black foreign correspondent of the era, for traveling to Cuba um, uh, amidst the embargo. And he traveled to Cuba to meet with Robert F. Williams, another radical activist. So there's 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 so much relationships and intimacies across the political spectrum. And Freedom Season takes you inside those rooms, including the summit, and it takes you in places where it's not just Birmingham that year, Gina. It's like Greenwood, Mississippi is on the front pages of the New York Times, and it's places like Detroit, Michigan, right? And it's really seeing how activists are really interested in African decolonization and African liberation movements. In Ghana and in Kenya and in the Congo, right? So it's very interesting when you just can see how that year unfolds chronologically. It's really, really fascinating. And for me to research and write these years, it was really fascinating to see. And really, I think 63 is the key year of the 1960s.
Absolutely. And you write that Dr. King's dream resembled a chaotic nightmare for Bobby and Jack Kennedy. Why was that?
The Kennedys are very, very interesting figures, Gina. The best way to describe the Kennedys at the start of the year vis-a-vis civil rights would be reluctant, because they didn't want civil rights and the struggle for Black dignity and citizenship to overwhelm their administrative agenda. Civil rights activists argued that civil rights was the agenda
Mhm.
because it was a pursuit of multiracial democracy. And so when we think about Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, what's so interesting, SNCC, and SNCC is a group that is founded in the aftermath of the February 1st, 1960 sit-in in Greensboro, North Carolina, at a Woolworth's lunch counter, which is now a civil rights museum. And that sit-in on February 1st leads to over 60,000 students protesting in the spring of 1960. But there's an activist and a feminist organizer named Ella Jo Baker, and Barbara Ransby has a great book on Ella Jo Baker, about Ella Baker and the Black Freedom Struggle, a classic book from several years ago. And when we think about Ella Baker, she is an NAACP organizer, a trade unionist. She's executive director of the SCLC for a time. She's in a group called In Friendship in the 1950s that helps civil rights activists. And Ella Baker is really one of the foremost democratic theorists of the 20th century. And so Ella Baker organizes the temporary Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee Easter weekend at Shaw University in Raleigh, North Carolina, from April 15th to April 17th of 1960. And SNCC is going to attract some of the best organizers in the country, predominantly Black, but by 1964, SNCC's going to have an injection of white volunteers with Freedom Summer. But what's so interesting about looking at SNCC and people like Bob Moses and Diane Nash and others in 1963 is how fearful the Kennedy administration was of them. So when we look at them from the perspective of 63, the Kennedy administration perceived of SNCC as if they were the Black Panthers, right? So it's important for us to understand it. This is before overtly there's an embrace of Black nationalism and Pan-Africanism and revolutionary politics like that. That is simmering. That is simmering. That's there, but it's not overt. But the Kennedy administration was so fearful. And remember, SNCC and people like Bob Moses are trying to bring small d democracy to Mississippi Delta, Arkansas, Southwest Georgia, and other parts of the country. So they are not violent revolutionaries. They're the opposite. They are certainly revolutionaries. Um, so the Kennedy administration looks upon Martin Luther King Jr. as sort of the best of worst solutions that are at their disposal. That's why one chapter is characterized. The title of it is a quote from Bobby Kennedy: "If King loses, worse leaders will take his place." Like the Muslims, right? And they were always the Muslims. Journalists call them the Black Muslims, but throughout my book, I just call them Muslims because that's what they call themselves. And so when we think about the Kennedy administration, they get dragged kicking and screaming into the fray in 63. But I do document the evolution of the Kennedys, right? And there is evolution with John F. Kennedy. It's not a linear evolution. I think the best 3 days of JFK's presidency, and I document this in the chapter Kennedy's Finest Moments, moment is as June 9th, 10th, and 11th. The speeches in Honolulu, to the Conference of Mayors, over 600, great racial justice speech. Teddy Sorensen, the speechwriter from Nebraska, is with him. I got a chance to meet Mr. Sorensen, the late Ted Sorensen, when I taught at Brandeis University. I met Ted Sorensen maybe now it's going to be 17 years ago. And extraordinary figure, speechwriter, gives Kennedy the spare, eloquent, really at times breathtaking, simple prose that characterizes the best of the new frontier. And so the speeches in Honolulu, American University, which is the anti-nuclear proliferation speech, where he's talking about that we're all mortal. It's a small planet. And he's the first president to use the word diversity in a major speech, where he says, even though we're not going to agree with the Soviet Union, we can at least make the world safe for diversity. He says that in that speech. It's really interesting doing the research and being able to not only go to presidential libraries and archives, but really read, a couple of hundred newspapers, different newspapers and magazines from the 60s, and really be able to read all of what they were writing in 1963, from um, things like Harper's and National Review, to Esquire, and just dozens, and they're listed in the sources, but just dozens of important journals and magazines that are no longer around. Because one of the interesting things about 63 is that it's really one of the last peak years of that post-war World War II reading boom. So it's not just Life magazine and Time magazine. Um, it is so many different magazines, where a magazine like Holiday had a subscription rate of 1 million people reading. So there's a post World War II reading boom, and Americans have never read journals like The Reporter and Saga, and the Saturday Review, the Saturday Evening Post, which is still around. It's so interesting to be able to read this. Look magazine could have, over 1 million people looking at it every week. And that really impacted the civil rights movement and the story of civil rights. So it's not just television and radio, it's really a sort of a reading public that is eager to listen and to take on this information.
Yeah. And speaking of the Kennedys, you write about a meeting between James Baldwin and Bobby Kennedy that did not go exactly as planned. Can you tell us about that?
Yes, this is the chapter's called The Summit. And when we think about that meeting, this is a very, very important meeting, that to set up the meeting. So James Baldwin becomes such a pivotal figure in 63. And this is the high point of his popularity. He's got two of the best-selling books, nonfiction. It's The Fire Next Time. Fiction, It's Another Country, which came out in 62, but it's in paperback in 63. That's the number 2 novel, best-selling novel of the year. The Fire Next Time is the number 1 nonfiction book of the year. And so he's doing speeches and tours, and he's an activist for the Congress of Racial Equality, public intellectual, major figure. He's on the cover of Time magazine by May 17th. There's a major story, 10, 11-page story by the writer, the journalist Jane Howard, in Life magazine the next week. So he's a political and cultural touchstone in 63. Bobby Kennedy notes that they had met briefly before, the year before, at a conference where the White House invited different cultural figures, and Bobby Kennedy invites him to breakfast at Hickory Hill in McLean, Virginia. And it's over breakfast that they decide to meet each other a few days later. Bobby Kennedy's father's house in Central Park West, the penthouse apartment where um, Baldwin invites, Kennedy wants him to invite cultural figures who've got the pulse of of the Negro in the parlance of 1963. And Baldwin invites Kenneth Clark, the famous black psychologist of the doll test, the Supreme Court 1954 Brown decision. Clark and his wife, Mamie Clark, authors of The Dark Ghetto, they had been cited. They were the only scholars cited by Earl Warren's decision, um, where the black girl chose the white doll over the black doll, to talk about the negative effects, psychological effects of racial segregation. So Kenneth Clark is there, Lena Horne is there, Harry Belafonte is there, Lorraine Hansberry is there, some other folks, including one of Baldwin's brothers, David Baldwin, is there. But there's also a 25-year-old civil rights activist named Jerome Smith from Louisiana CORE, Congress of Racial Equality, who's there. And Smith really challenges Bobby Kennedy's perceptions of what's going on. Kennedy is there with his aide, Burke Marshall, and he's expecting validation. And you can kind of see the ego uh, on people who are in government and people who are powerful, right? And Kennedy, we have to remember, Kennedy in 1963, and I think Freedom Season shows this, and this gets lost in history. Kennedy is on his way really to being the next uh, Democratic presidential nominee in 1968. Um, if his brother doesn't die, Kennedy is an American prime minister. Everybody knows it. By 1963, Esquire, Look Magazine, they're writing the stories that Bobby is going to be up against LBJ for the Democratic National presidential nomination, and that Bobby has tons of charisma, and LBJ, who will be 60 something by that point, is not. So Bobby is an extraordinary figure in 63, a figure we've never had before in American history and never had since, because we've never had cabinet members who are family in American history. We've had very interesting. We've had fathers and sons who served as presidents. We've had grandfathers and grandsons who've served as presidents. But we've never had a president ever have somebody in their cabinet be just a blood relation to, right? So, the Senate probably wouldn't confirm that person now, or maybe they would. We live in strange time, but in normative times in the post-war period, this is very extraordinary. So Bobby comes in with a lot of egos, and there's going to be 3 hours of a back and forth. I mean, James Baldwin wants the president to escort the black students who are going to be enrolled at the University of Alabama personally over and above George Wallace, the governor of Alabama's threat to do the stand at the schoolhouse door to prevent the integration of the University of Alabama. They want the president to issue a second Emancipation Proclamation symbolically. They want the president to do a major address and to put up a 1963 Civil Rights Act that comprehensively ends racial segregation in the federal government, but also in public accommodations, restaurants, amusement parks, that makes it illegal, hotels, and they want full voting rights. And they want protection of Black people who are demonstrating. This is May 24th, 1963. This is after the violence that we've seen in Birmingham. King's letter from Birmingham jail describes that and is published right around that time, May, June. So it's an extraordinary meeting, and both sides leak different versions of that meeting. So Bobby leaks it to Scotty Reston and his folks. Baldwin leaks it to his folks, and you can see this big gap in terms of perception, right? Bobby comes away thinking, well, they just don't know how the federal government works, and King is more pragmatic. This was a big mistake. They come away, Kenneth Clark says that, hey, Bobby Kennedy represents the best of his kind, but it's still very, very tragic that he's not understanding and not seeing us as human beings. So Baldwin, which is the last time Baldwin meets up with Bobby Kennedy, Baldwin says he always liked Bobby Kennedy, but he's very, very witheringly critical of Kennedy. And then the punchline to all this, because another person who's there, Gina, is Clarence Jones, who's Martin Luther King Jr.'s attorney. The punchline negative to this is that Bobby Kennedy basically puts an FBI jacket on everybody who's at the meeting. And Baldwin's FBI file, boom, they're on him. Um, After the meeting, he authorizes a wiretap of Clarence Jones, King's attorney's home and office telephones. And it's through that wiretap, the FBI wiretap, that Bobby authorizes that really leads to a snowball effect for the Kennedy administration, J. Edgar Hoover, the FBI, and King, because it's through the Clarence Jones wiretap that they find out about King's extramarital affairs. And before this, they had no clue. And what Hoover does is switch it from saying, well, King's a communist and has all these communists with him, to saying King is a sexual degenerate and leaking all these things to government officials. So it's a really consequential meeting.
Yeah. And then another really poignant moment with the Kennedys is the fact that JFK didn't attend the funerals of any of the children of Birmingham, which you think that's a no-brainer to just go to the funeral of a child. Why didn't he?
Well, it's politics. He doesn't want to completely lose the South. And by 63 and September 15th, 16th, when this happens, he's thinking ahead to 1964 and the election. And there's a real fear among Democrats with the rise of the John Bircherites, the rise of the far right. Certainly, people can already see that perhaps Nelson Rockefeller is not going to be the challenger to Kennedy. It's going to be a far right challenger. And if you lose the entire South, it upends the political calculus. In fact, there's a great scene with Jack Kennedy talking to a senator from Louisiana, and they're talking about how he's being reassured that the Dixiecrats who are pro Kennedy, because Kennedy had some Dixiecrats who were pro Kennedy, we're going to prevent the Southern strategy, which is already being unraveled and unfolded in 63, of running favorite sons and trying to place the 1964 election into the House of Representatives, where a coalition of Dixiecrats and Republicans would choose the next president, right? So Kennedy is actually fearful of these things, and he had a right to be, because it doesn't happen in 64 because of, in certain ways, because of his own assassination, but by 68 you see the power of George Wallace, 10, 12, 13 million votes. And Richard Nixon wins the presidency with a plurality of 43%. The irony, of course, is that the president's younger brother is assassinated before he can win the Democratic Party nomination. And he most likely would have won the presidency with the plurality and been able to beat Nixon in the 40s versus Hubert Humphrey. Because again, some people would say paradoxically, I don't think it's a paradox, but it's not what people have a hard time understanding. America can be multiple things at the same time. Bobby Kennedy would have gotten a lot more Wallace voters than Humphrey ever would have been able to get, because of the popularity of the Kennedy name, the Kennedy iconography in 68, the assassination of the brother. There are overt racists who, during Kennedy's 82-day campaign, are vowing to vote for him. They don't want their schools desegregated. They don't want racial integration. They want to meet Bobby Kennedy, and they are voting for him for presidency. Does that mean he would have been reelected? I have no idea. But in 68, he would have been able to win, not with 50% of the vote. Wallace makes that point moot, but he would have been able to defeat Richard Nixon.
Yeah, and speaking of another hero in your book, Medgar Evers gives, you said, a speech for the ages during this year. What was that speech?
Well, Medgar Evers gives a speech in late May of 1963, where he's really responding to Mayor Allen Thompson, the Jackson mayor, who's a segregationist, a speech that he had made saying that the NAACP didn't have to show up in Jackson because Negroes were treated so well there. Police loved them. Everybody loved and respected them. And this was a lie. This was untrue. Jackson was a place of brutality and segregation, racial hatred. And Medgar Evers demands equal time, and the station gives him equal time. So he's able to give a really a really panoramic speech where he talks about one being a native Mississippian, that he's not an outsider, that he's a multi-generational American. He talks about his military service and background, how he went overseas to defeat what he calls Hitlerism and fascism. He talks about Black people in Mississippi realizing their connections with the struggles for African liberation in the Congo, and that in certain ways, Black people in Africa are progressing at a faster rate than they are in Mississippi. So it's a really it's so interesting because you get a look into Medgar Evers's mind and his intellectual ability. It's a brilliant, brilliant speech, and it shows you why so many people followed Evers, but also why he was so feared. He's 37, former football player, um, unbelievably courageous, handsome, um, married, father of three, and just he's got so much fortitude and rectitude. James Baldwin talks about meeting him and just feeling how he gives you so much courage just being around him, where he presents this figure who's never going to leave Mississippi, and he says it. He says, "I was born in Mississippi, and I'm going to change Mississippi. I'm not fleeing Mississippi." Right. So he's an extraordinary figure, and what I wanted to show in Freedom Season is that even before the assassination, we can see the New York Times does a profile of him. We can see the rise of this figure. We can see the impact that he has on people like Bob Moses and SNCC. We can see the impact he has on James Baldwin and James Meredith, who had been the first Black student to enroll at Ole Miss in September of 1962. And the Kennedys were still reeling from the disastrous integration of Ole Miss with over 500 federal troops and people, a couple of people dying, and that there were still troops stationed there. And James Meredith eventually graduates. He does a 1 year graduate degree, but they're still reeling from that, right? And that's why Kennedy was always very, very much afraid to do a public um, a public speech about race because he felt when he tried to ask people to step up to the plate in the fall, vis-a-vis fall of 62, vis-a-vis James Meredith, the exact opposite happened. It became a huge 3 days of rioting in Oxford, Mississippi.
Yeah. Well, our chat is starting to blow up. So before I pass you back to Ryan, just wondering what you hope readers take away upon finishing this work.
Well, I think it's a tragic year, but it's also a triumphant year. So I hope people take away hope because we're able to see the way in which people debated these ideas, the way in which they created and were interested in coalitional politics, um, the way in which people weren't looking for they weren't really looking for safe spaces in that time. They were really ready to debate and confront each other. But I will say that the best and the most fruitful debates were people debating in good faith, right? And so by good faith meant people who were saying, at least rhetorically, they were proponents of multiracial democracy, but they had different tactics and strategies on how to get there. Not everybody was interested in good faith debates. We think about the far right wing who were racist and conspiracy theorists, and they're there too. But it was a very, very interesting time, and the country unravels and comes back together again. And I think Baldwin becomes key here. And I'm working on another Baldwin project too about Baldwin in '63. And what's interesting is his idea of this grand American republic is very, very multiracial, aspirational, but it's not naive. He says the only way we can get there is through confronting the original sin of racial slavery, its afterlife as Jim Crow, racial segregation, and terror, but also the lies that that afterlife is based on, right? So Baldwin is very, very interesting and important here. And you can see that with the conferences where he's at the SNCC conference in November when Kennedy's alive, but then in December when Kennedy has perished, and how Baldwin really excoriates the Kennedys for not caring enough about the children in Birmingham, right? And I named the children in Birmingham um, a number of times.
And it's not just the girls. That's what I think people forget, the boys who are murdered too.
Absolutely. So it's Carol Robertson, Addie Mae Collins, Cynthia Wesley, Denise McNair, Johnny Robinson, and Virgil Peanut Ware are six children who are all killed, murdered in Birmingham in one day. And Baldwin wants us all to collectively mourn, right? So even once Kennedy's assassinated, Baldwin is very, very upset because he sees the collective mourning, including a bunch of Black people who are really bereft, but he wants that kind of humanity for those children, right? And for Medgar Evers and Medgar Evers' family. So I think what I want readers to get out of it is to see the way in which the country at its best um, is able to reimagine itself, even though it often takes the crucible of of tragedy for that reimagining. But I think 63 offers really, really important lessons for the present and for those who are uh, on this call through who teach high school or college or elementary school. I think that's what it gives us because you're able to see the ideas in action once you take apart that year, right? So it's not that we say, hey, this happened in 63 and now we got to move on into 64. And the book is organized in four parts: winter, spring, summer, and autumn. And we're able to see how each season has its own flavor, right? And certainly I think the summer is unbelievably optimistic, even though there are still tragedies in the summer. And there's I think the longest chapter in here is on the March on Washington, and it's called The Language of Human Joy. And so there's something terribly poignant about that. And I'll say the last thing they asked James Baldwin, what does he feel about the March on Washington after its success? And it's an amazing success, and we're able to be there with the Kennedys and the activists after. So you're really able to sit in there. And he says that he'd have to cry or sing to articulate his feelings. So Baldwin's always wonderful, but I think I want people to get the full panoramic, kaleidoscopic feeling of this year. But again, it's not just tragedy; it's triumph, and you can come away from reading about 63 and learning about 63 with a lot more optimism for our time than you would expect.
It's fantastic. Well, thank you so much. I'm going to pass you over to Ryan.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, thank you so much, Gina. That was awesome to listen to. For those who know our program well, you know that we always begin this part of the show with our student scholar question of the week. For those who are newer or need a reminder, just this is a weekly competition in which students have the opportunity to submit questions from all around the world, actually. And the winning question will be read aloud to our esteemed guest. And the winner will also receive a $50 gift card to our gift shop for themselves and their teacher. And the questions are always excellent. I think this week is no exception. Our winner is Alexandria, who is a student at uh, Watchung Hills Regional High School in New Jersey in Mr. News class. And Alexandra asks this. From Lincoln's emancipation to 1963, the government had changed the way they recognize African American rights through new laws. Despite these changes being present, how would you say society was able to adapt from 1863 to 1963 with these new laws? Were there any negative stereotypes about miscegenation upheld regardless of governmental change?
Well, so 1963 is a very interesting year because even though Brown had passed in 1954, there was slow enforcement. There was voluntary enforcement, but the big enforcement of Brown doesn't happen until after 1969. And so when we think about 63, it's really a pre-civil rights racial equality landscape. So, what Black people are facing vis-a-vis cultural stereotypes of miscegenation, this is before the Loving decision, 4 years. So, certain states have outlawed interracial marriage and interracial intimacy. Is really systematic subjugation. Sometimes people, I think, erroneously called Black people second-class citizens. In a democracy, you don't have classes of citizenship. You're either a citizen or you're not. So there is a non-citizen status of Black people and Black communities there. So that's what we're facing, and that's why um, even by the time JFK does his June 11th civil rights speech, he says that it's not a regional problem or a sectional problem. There's a revolution happening nationally. And a great anecdote here is the writer John Williams, who wrote the book "The Man Who Cried I Am," does a great article that then becomes a book for Holiday Magazine in 1963, where he travels all across the country talking to different people, white and Black, Midwest, the South, the North, the West Coast, and he sees these problems everywhere: Colorado, Minnesota. And I was doing the research. It was great to read newspapers from those places where you saw these problems were everywhere. So this was not something that was just in the South. Although most Black people lived in the South, this is a time of migration where people are migrating outside of the South. Um, but it's not just a coastal problem. So it was very prevalent in 1963. And that's why there was such a big push for the Civil Rights Act of 1963, which is eventually passed as the Civil Rights Act of 1964 on July 2nd.
Wow, fascinating. Thanks so much for that great question and answer, of course. Okay, so many questions. I'll try to get to as many as possible in our chat. Sam says, you mentioned Bob Moses. Could you talk a little bit more about the incredible bravery and effectiveness of the organizing Moses and his colleagues and community in 1963? Do you think he's an underrated figure in today's kind of landscape, historiography, etc.?
Oh, absolutely. So there's a good, relatively new biography of Bob Moses that I would tell everybody to check out. Um, so Moses is the Hamilton College grad, a philosopher, math teacher, who really tries to initially help Martin Luther King Jr. in the SCLC and becomes mentored by Ella Baker. And Moses goes to Macomb, Mississippi, where he meets up with Herbert Lee and other activists. And he is a truly phenomenal figure, the late Bob Moses. And Moses is the one who really embeds himself and creates a framework for SNCC's activism with local people in the Mississippi Delta through attentive listening, listening to what local people feel they need and want and have. And part of integrating himself with local people, somebody who is from the North, um, is wearing sharecroppers overalls, being very simple, speaking as plainly as possible. The horn rimmed glasses like Malcolm X, but a different figure for Bob Moses. So Moses becomes a very kind of prophetic figure who many people try to adapt his mannerisms. He's so obviously brilliant that he's the one who white student volunteers are very, very drawn to Moses because Moses sort of is somebody who's very legible to them. A lot of white students who were drawn to SNCC in the South, they couldn't find for many of them the legibility in people like Fannie Lou Hamer and others. Like so Fannie Lou Hamer is brilliant too, but sharecropper, Ruleville, transformed by SNCC, but she's not speaking um, the same way that white students from the North and the Midwest and the West Coast found, hey, this is my sweet spot, right? So Moses is a critical figure. We see Moses in 63 in Greenwood, Mississippi, um, survive an assassination attempt. Um, survived jail. We see his increasing disappointment with the Kennedy administration. We see him at Howard University saying SNCC is going to change the country through an annealing process, and it's going to remold the country. Um, and he agrees with Ted White's description because Ted White he doesn't agree with Ted White saying they're lunatics and aliens. But Theodore White, the journalist who had written the book about the 1960 presidential election, basically, again, castigates SNCC as a kind of modern Black Panther party, right? Like that. And again, this is before the Black Panthers. This is before Lowndes County Panthers or the Huey Newton, Kathleen Cleaver, Bobby Hutton, Bobby Seale Panthers. And what's so interesting is that Moses is alongside of Ella Baker one of the most important architects of SNCC, and there's going to be a wing of people who really just support Moses, and there's going to be other divisions within that organization as the years go through. But 63 is a year where there's still um, real consensus and solidarity within SNCC. And Moses is also going to be the architect of Freedom Summer that happens in 64, where they try to really um, take over the state of Mississippi alongside of 1,100 or so white volunteers to build up freedom schools, civics classes, free Southern theater, mobile libraries, again, to try to bring democracy to parts of Mississippi that had not seen it since Reconstruction.
Wow, fascinating. Great question and great answer. Saeed, who's a student at Stuyvesant High School, asked an interesting question. He says, "I've always been curious. What was it about Islam that appealed to figures like Malcolm X and Muhammad Ali in their fight for Black liberation?"
Yeah, I think Islam appeals to Malcolm and Ali because they perceive it to be a religion that is a global religion, that is not a religion that is justifying and rationalizing racial slavery in the United States. They look upon Christianity as they get deeper into their own history as a religion of white supremacy, as a religion that justified racial slavery through biblical text and saying black people were the cursed children of Ham. And so when we think about Islam, Islam provides, and again, when we think about Islam just as a religion, Islam is a religion that talks about just like Christianity, peace and the afterlife, and spreading goodwill and doing good things across the world. And Islam, like Christianity, has a prophet, Muhammad as a prophet. Jesus is the Christian prophet. So I think it makes a lot of sense, especially once people read about racial slavery in the United States and read the way in which you had and it's very similar to modern, at least evangelical Christianity today, that can rationalize and justify all kinds of inequality and overt racism and white supremacy still under religious garb. Finding that out alienates Malcolm X and Muhammad Ali from Christianity, but not from religion, not from a kind of religious faith, a deep faith. So I'd say that's why. So it's getting that history, and so for them, Islam becomes a key for um, justice and freedom and dignity, whereas Christianity becomes a key for, and the Nation of Islam has this slavery, suffering, and death. They have that where, and not just Christianity, but the American flag becomes a symbol of slavery, suffering, and death. And again, obviously, this is not hyperbolic. It happened in our country, unless you efface and erase that history, which even in 63 there were some people trying to do, just like in 2025. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. Several people in the chat are asking this question. I know sometimes historians are a little bit leery about what if questions, but just wondering if JFK had lived, do you think that civil rights legislation would have carried out? How would things have been different as far as that huge piece, that huge bill and the civil rights movement, legislation, et cetera?
What I would say is that if JFK had lived and been reelected, civil rights acts and the voting rights acts eventually would have passed. I think that um, probably America's involvement in Vietnam is going to be attenuated, not because Kennedy is I think Kennedy is a different political actor than Lyndon Baines Johnson. So Kennedy feels more sure of himself um, intellectually than Lyndon Baines Johnson, and he feels more sure of himself in the international arena. So I don't think Vietnam would have been continuously escalated with nothing in return to be a political liability for both Kennedy and the Democratic Party, right? So that's kind of, in certain ways, the reason why Vietnam continues to be escalated. LBJ doesn't feel he can get out of it. He doesn't feel he can get out of it. I think Kennedy would have felt differently. I think Kennedy just felt more sure of himself on those issues. But I do think civil rights and voting rights would have passed. I think it wouldn't have necessarily passed on the timeline. I don't think it's the 66, 64, 65 timeline. But I think as long as he's reelected, the crisis points are there where it's going to pass. Certainly, his assassination helps the 64 Act get passed, but really just that one, because it takes another crisis at Selma to get the Voting Rights Act passed, right? So I do think eventually, if Kennedy was reelected, I think Civil Rights Act probably is passed in 65, and maybe the Voting Rights Act passed in 66. So I think it's delayed somewhat.
Absolutely. And sort of a nice part two to that question is from Pete. Can you just tell the audience or explain something he's always been more curious about is how Johnson's appeal and his push for the civil rights legislation, where did that come from? From a someone from the deep South? You know, it's surprising to Pete. What caused his support for the civil rights legislation, Johnson specifically?
Well, LBJ, I mean, part of it's just pragmatic. Part of it's just pragmatism. He's going to need that civil rights coalition to regain the nomination or gain the nomination. I mean, the worst thing he could have done after Kennedy's assassination was to rebuke civil rights, just politically within the Democratic Party, because Bobby Kennedy would have loved to have been the 1964 Democratic nominee for president. And there were the reason why LBJ at the convention in Atlantic City doesn't even let Bobby Kennedy speak until the third day is because he feared if Bobby Kennedy really had the roster the first day, delegates would be swayed by emotion that they would throw him overboard and put Bobby in. And he wasn't far off. Bobby receives a 12, 15-minute standing ovation. Because so people have to, that's a great question. So Sam, people have JFK was an icon when he was living. The assassination makes him a bigger icon. He's no longer alive. So the person who people are looking at is his brother. His brother's so JFK was 6'1", Bobby Kennedy's 5'10", right? So there's enough there for people to say, now you're my guy. You're our guy, right? So it's political royalty. So LBJ, who had instances of both racism and support for civil rights even before, Senate Majority Leader, but even before teaching Mexican students in Cotula, Texas, and just a very interesting career as a New Dealer, but also being mentored by Richard Russell and people who were very sort of white supremacists, right? And so, in a way, he's more viable by 63, 64 after the assassination saying he's pro civil rights than anything else because that's where the Democratic Party is headed. That's where black voters who remember there's still a group of black voters who can vote in New York and Illinois and New Jersey and Ohio and Pennsylvania who are outside of those who are captured in the South, right? So there's still electoral and voting rights there too. So it's pragmatic, but he also is on the side of the underdog as a New Dealer, right? But he's going to be always a complicated figure. I mean, he's not enamored with Dr. King and Dr. King's radicalism. He certainly hates Stokely Carmichael and the Black Power activists who come, right? So he's a complicated figure, but in 63, 64, 65, what we're seeing is that you're seeing the consensus that's created because of 63, including the JFK assassination, but not only the JFK assassination, as my book shows.
Fascinating. Great question and great answer. I'd be remiss if I didn't somehow ask this question. It's been in our chat, and people have asked me leading up to this session, just in terms of how teachers, or so many teachers on this call, how teachers can use this book in the classroom. Many would love to do it, integrate it into their lesson plans. How can teachers use this great book in their lesson planning in classrooms? And again, there's links in the chat for them to get their hands on this book. We encourage them to do so. And then also just a word, this period, this topic has somehow become once again controversial to teach.
Yeah.
Any advice that you would have, or suggestions, or to our many teachers and on the call today?
Oh, absolutely. I think 63, there's a lot of ways to teach this that include race, but also so transcend it in the sense of freedom of speech and freedom of expression. Folks who are demonstrating and folks who are interested in civil discourse. That's all throughout 63. I think in 63, we see debates over political and intellectual ideas in the cultural landscape that are wide open. Um, I think we see political divisions and partisanship, but ways to go beyond that division and partisanship. So that's another lesson of 63. I think we see the power of rhetoric, whether it's coming from John F. Kennedy or Gloria Richardson or Malcolm X or Bobby Kennedy or James Baldwin. I think we see the power of writing, especially through James Baldwin. But we see so many different small magazines and literary debates happening that are global in scope. Um, and I also think there's the international Cold War context here, where you see that the anti-colonial struggle is bleeding into the civil rights movement and vice versa, right? And so there's so many different things to teach here about democracy, about how people do organizing, social movement organizing, but also how the federal government works, right? How presidents and attorney generals may think about it differently from activists at the grassroots, right? Like, what does this mean? And really the political calculations for people who are elected officials as opposed to citizens who want deep transformative change and at times want it and need it immediately, right? And I finally say, in terms of now, how do we teach these things, especially in an age of huge suppression and banning? Is that I think we teach it as American history, right? We teach it as American history. Everything in Freedom Season actually happened. There's a basis of fact in there that there's endnotes and a bibliography and archival and all these things. But we're teaching American history. Sometimes we call it social studies. And in teaching about the past, we always have to remind our students we're really always talking about the present and the future as well, right?
Absolutely. And perhaps this is a good accumulating question before I throw things back to Gina for some final thoughts. And it's from Alicia, who asks, this book obviously delves into 1963. Is there another year in the civil rights movement that would sort of bookend a lot of the themes that you talk about here? I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I know 68 is so pivotal. Or is there another year that might bookend this 63?
Yeah, I think 68 with the passions that are unleashed in 68. But I think 63 is the reason why 68 happens, right? 63 sets up the context for what we're going to see in 68, including it's so interesting the denouement of both King and Bobby are so close, even though those two were never personally close, but they become very close in the imagination, the historical imagination, because of their untimely deaths. And they're around the same age. Bobby Kennedy's born in 1925, same year as Malcolm X. Dr. King, 1929. Um, but one thing I'll say very quickly, when we think about the themes of the book, because I saw a chat, so the themes are themes of dignity, citizenship, democracy, and freedom, right? And I want to break those down. So dignity, what activists, especially led by Malcolm X, argued was that dignity was something that was God-given and intrinsic to all human beings, irrespective of color. Citizenship is merely the external recognition of dignity, right? And so dignity is very, very key here because Malcolm and people like Baldwin would argue that everyone had dignity, but Black people, they had dignity and needed to realize that they had that dignity and feel that worth and that value. Because, like another questionnaire said, the cultural stereotypes, the inequality, the racism, the mistreatment, the disrespect can cause people to lose their dignity. And this happens to certainly Black people, but it happens to people who are disabled. It happens to queer people. It happens to women. It happens to all kinds of people who, for some reason, communities or institutions or society treat them as less than. So this dignity is a huge, huge theme. And over time, by the time Kennedy talks about it's a moral issue in his June 11th speech, and using the language of the civil rights movement and says that there's a revolution happening and those who do nothing invite shame as well as violence. Those who act boldly recognize right as well as reality. That's a speech about dignity, even as he's talking about disparities and all these things. King's I Have a Dream speech, John Lewis's March on Washington speech. These are speeches about dignity, the inherent dignity that we all have. And then they're simultaneously trying to connect it to citizenship so you get that external recognition. But dignity is always the key. Dignity is always the key. They want an expansive notion of citizenship that is so expansive that includes Black people. And then when it comes to democracy, they're pushing multiracial democracy, which we first should have had after the Civil War. The Civil War is fought over multiracial democracy. And we don't get it institutionalized until post 63. And then finally, this idea of freedom. How does it look like to you? How does it look like to me? How does it feel? And there are all these debates, and we're getting sentiment polling. Newsweek does the first Lewis Harris poll of Black people in 63. There are polls of white attitudes and sentiments in 63. So this is all happening together, and people are defining freedom in different ways. Some people are saying, I don't want to live next door to a Negro. Some people are saying, I want the freedom to travel across country with my children and not have to use the Green Book. The Green Book showed you where Negro motorists and travelers could eat and sleep and have a restroom. And some people saying, my vision of freedom is that I don't have to use this, right? So freedom, right? How do we define it? Very, very interesting and important. John F. Kennedy says we don't ask about color before we send soldiers to Berlin or around the world or Germany, right? So very, very interesting, right? So freedom is another big theme. Who has it? How do we express it? Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much for adding that. Perfect end note. So many questions we didn't get to. I apologize for that. Get your hands on this book. All your answers can be found, or your questions can be answered in the book. Gina, back to you for some final thoughts.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah, and as Ryan mentioned, if you purchase our book today at bookshop.org, the affiliate commission we receive supports our programming for history teachers and students. And it
Great.
yes, a really fantastic read and is great to use excerpts from in the classroom. I highly recommend it for every teacher, non-teacher, reader on the call. And we hope you'll join us next week when we welcome the author Rick Atkinson and his book, The Fate of the Day, The War for America, Fort Ticonderoga to Charleston, 1777 to 1780. And you can explore our archive of more than 250 scholar presentations at bookbreaks at gilderlehrman.org/bookbreaks, as well as the Hamilton Education Program, historical documents, and so much more. Dr. Joseph, it was such an honor to have you here today and chat with you. And please come back for your Baldwin book.
Oh, yes, I will. Thank you so much.
Right. Have a great day, everyone.